my sister Cordelia walked into that World War II aircraft hangar in Phoenix back in 2019, 20 veteran mechanics turned to look at her, and I swear you could feel the skepticism rolling off them like heat from the desert pavement. She was 34 then, this brilliant aerospace engineer who'd been designing components for Boeing's latest passenger jets. But to these guys, she looked like just another corporate suit who'd wandered into their world of grease and metal. The lead mechanic, Frank Torino, didn't even try to hide his doubts. He crossed his arms over his oil-stained coveralls and said flat out, "Lady, this engine has been stumping the best restoration experts in the country for 6 months. A woman could never figure out what we can't." The other mechanics chuckled and nodded like they were watching some predictable comedy show. But here's what they didn't know about my big sister. Cordelia had been taking apart engines since she was 12 years old. When our dad's riding mower died and he was ready to haul it to the scrapyard, she spent her entire summer vacation in our garage, covered head to toe in motor oil, rebuilding that Briggs and Stratton engine from scratch. Dad came home from work one evening to find her mowing the backyard with a machine he'd written off as hopeless. That's just who Cordelia is. She sees problems where other people see impossibilities. She finds solutions hiding in places nobody else thinks to look. Growing up, she was the one we called when the washing machine started making that horrible grinding noise, when Mom's car wouldn't start on cold mornings, when the furnace decided to quit in the middle of January. She never met a mechanical problem she couldn't solve, never walked away from a challenge that seemed too big. So when she heard those mechanics laughing at her credentials, when she felt their eyes dismissing her before she'd even had a chance to prove what she could do, something shifted in her expression. I've seen that look before. It's the same look she had when her engineering professors told her women didn't have the spatial reasoning skills for aerospace design. It's the same look she wore when her first boss at Boeing suggested she might be happier in the administrative department. The aircraft sitting in that hangar wasn't just any warplane. It was tail number 4415562, a P-51 Mustang that had belonged to our grandfather, Captain Thaddeus Hayes. He died in 1944 when that plane crashed during what the military called a routine training flight. For 75 years, our family had accepted the official report that blamed mechanical failure. But Cordelia had always wondered about the details that didn't quite add up, the inconsistencies in the paperwork that nobody else seemed to notice. She'd kept his flight jacket hanging in her closet since college, still carrying the faint scent of aviation fuel and leather. His medals sat in a small wooden box on her dresser. Every year on the anniversary of his death, she'd pull out his service photos and wonder what kind of man he'd been, what he might have taught her about flying, about engineering, about pushing boundaries that other people said couldn't be crossed. When the commemorative Air Force acquired Grandpa's actual aircraft for restoration, Cordelia took her first vacation in 3 years to volunteer her time. She drove 12 hours from Seattle to Phoenix because she needed to touch the metal he'd touched, to understand the machine that had carried him through his final flight. She arrived expecting to honor his memory by helping bring his plane back to life. Instead, she walked into an argument that had been going on for months. The restoration team was completely baffled by a modification someone had made to the Packard Merlin engine. It was unlike anything they'd seen before, a bizarre alteration to the supercharger housing that should have destroyed the engine's performance. Yet according to the flight logs, this particular P-51 had been one of the fastest, most reliable aircraft in its squadron right up until the day it crashed. The modification made no engineering sense. It violated every principle of internal combustion engine design. The veteran mechanics had tried everything they could think of, consulted with experts across the country, even brought in specialists from the Smithsonian. Nothing. Nobody could figure out why someone would deliberately sabotage an engine's performance, or how the plane had continued flying so well with such a seemingly destructive alteration. That's when Frank looked at Cordelia with those dismissive eyes and told her that real mechanical work wasn't something you could solve with fancy computer programs and engineering degrees. That's when the other mechanics started making jokes about letting the desk jockey play with the big boys' toys. That's when 20 grown men decided that a woman couldn't possibly understand something they couldn't figure out. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just challenging Cordelia's professional expertise. They were questioning her connection to the grandfather she'd never met, the family legacy that had shaped her entire career, the mystery that had been eating at her for decades. They had no idea that what they'd found hidden in that engine would change everything our family thought we knew about Captain Thaddeus Hayes, and the real reason his plane had fallen from the sky on a clear October morning in 1944. Growing up, Cordelia and I knew almost nothing about our grandfather, except that he died young and our grandmother never liked talking about him. Captain Thaddeus Hayes was this ghostly figure in our family history, reduced to a handful of black and white photographs tucked away in Gran's jewelry box and a purple heart gathering dust on the mantelpiece. Gran would get this distant, pained look whenever we asked questions about him, so we learned early not to push. But Cordelia was different. Even as a kid, she'd sneak into Gran's room when she wasn't home and study those photographs for hours. There was something about Grandpa's face that fascinated her, the way he stood next to his aircraft with this quiet confidence, his hands resting on the propeller like he understood every bolt and wire that held the machine together. She'd trace her finger along the outline of his P-51 Mustang and whisper questions to the photograph that nobody could answer. When Gran passed away in 2003, Cordelia inherited his flight jacket and service medals. I remember watching her unfold that worn leather jacket in Gran's bedroom, how her hands trembled as she slipped it on over her college sweatshirt. It was too big for her, hanging loose around her shoulders, but something about wearing it changed her posture. She stood straighter, more determined, like she was carrying forward some unfinished mission she didn't fully understand yet. The official story was simple and tragic. Second Lieutenant Thaddeus Hayes, age 23, had taken off from Randolph Field in Texas on October 15, 1944, for what the military classified as routine pilot proficiency training. 2 hours later, his P-51 Mustang augured into a cotton field 30 miles south of San Antonio. The accident investigation concluded that mechanical failure in the engine had caused catastrophic power loss, giving him no chance to recover. Case closed, hero buried, family left with questions nobody seemed interested in answering. But Cordelia noticed things that didn't add up. Why was a stateside training pilot flying alone so far from the designated training area? Why were there no witnesses to the crash despite it happening in broad daylight over farmland? Why did the accident report mention engine modifications that weren't standard for training aircraft? She'd spent years trying to track down military records, flight logs, anything that might explain the inconsistencies, but most of the documentation from that era had been lost or destroyed decades ago. By 2019, she'd built an incredible career at Boeing, specializing in engine performance analysis for their next-generation passenger jets. She understood power plants in ways that would have amazed our grandfather, could diagnose problems in turbofan engines that stumped engineers with twice her experience. But all that professional success couldn't fill the gap where family history should have been, couldn't answer the questions that had been nagging at her since childhood. That's why when her contact at the Commemorative Air Force called to tell her they'd acquired a P-51 with tail number 4415562, she nearly dropped the phone. After 75 years, Grandpa's actual aircraft had surfaced from some private collector's hangar and was being donated for restoration. She immediately requested vacation time, something she hadn't done in over 3 years, and drove straight from Seattle to Phoenix with nothing but a duffel bag and Gran's old toolbox. The drive gave her 12 hours to think about what she hoped to accomplish. Maybe she'd learn something new about the crash by examining the wreckage firsthand. Maybe she'd find some small detail that the original investigators had missed. Or maybe she'd just get the chance to touch the metal her grandfather had touched, to sit in the cockpit where he'd spent his final moments, to feel some connection to the family legacy that had always felt so distant and incomplete. She arrived at the hangar on a Tuesday morning in September, when the Arizona heat was finally starting to break, and the desert air carried that clean, sharp scent that comes after months of blazing summer. The Commemorative Air Force facility was impressive, filled with restored warbirds from every era of military aviation. Volunteers in their 60s and 70s moved between the aircraft like devoted caretakers, each one an expert in keeping history alive through grease and sweat and stubborn determination. Cordelia introduced herself to Frank Torino, the lead restoration mechanic, explaining her relationship to the aircraft and her professional background. She was nervous but excited, finally getting the chance to honor her grandfather's memory in a tangible way. She expected to spend a few weeks helping with routine restoration work, maybe learning some new techniques from the old-timers, definitely gaining a deeper understanding of the machine that had shaped her family's destiny. Instead, she walked straight into the biggest mechanical mystery of her career. Frank Torino had been working on vintage aircraft engines since before Cordelia was born, and his frustration was written all over his weathered face as he led her to the partially disassembled P-51. He'd restored dozens of Packard Merlin V1650 engines during his 4 decades in the business, could rebuild one blindfolded using nothing but muscle memory and the sound of metal fitting against metal. But this particular engine had him completely stumped. "Look at this nonsense," Frank said, pointing to a series of modifications inside the supercharger housing. Someone went and altered the intake geometry, changed the impeller clearances, even rerouted some of the cooling passages. Problem is, everything they did should have turned this engine into a paperweight. These modifications would have reduced power output by at least 30%, probably caused catastrophic overheating within minutes of takeoff. Cordelia leaned in to examine the alterations more closely. The work was precise, clearly done by someone who understood engine internals, but Frank was absolutely right about the performance implications. Every modification seemed designed to sabotage the engine's effectiveness. It made no engineering sense whatsoever. "Here's the really weird part," Frank continued, pulling out a thick folder of documentation. "According to the flight logs from 1944, this particular aircraft consistently outperformed every other P-51 in its squadron. Faster climb rates, better fuel efficiency, superior high-altitude performance. The maintenance records show 0 mechanical problems right up until the day it crashed. So how does an engine with modifications that should destroy its performance end up being the best performer in the unit?" The other mechanics had gathered around to listen, and Cordelia could feel their skeptical energy. These were men who'd spent their lives working with their hands, who trusted experience over theory, who'd seen plenty of college-educated engineers fail to understand the practical realities of mechanical systems. To them, she represented everything they distrusted about modern aviation. Computer models instead of intuition, theoretical knowledge instead of hands-on experience, corporate bureaucracy instead of common-sense problem-solving. "Maybe the flight logs were wrong," suggested Pete Kowalski, a retired Air Force crew chief who specialized in World War II-era fighters. "Military paperwork wasn't exactly known for accuracy back then. Could be someone was fudging the numbers to make their unit look good." Frank shook his head. "I thought of that too, but I tracked down 3 other pilots who flew with your grandfather's squadron. They all remembered his plane being exceptionally fast, said it could outclimb and outrun anything else they had. One guy told me he always tried to fly formation with Hayes because that P-51 was so reliable." Cordelia studied the modifications again, trying to apply her knowledge of modern turbofan engines to this 75-year-old power plant. The alterations followed a pattern that seemed almost random until you considered advanced aerodynamic principles that hadn't been widely understood in 1944. It was like someone had been decades ahead of their time in terms of internal flow dynamics. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" she suggested. "What if these modifications weren't meant to alter engine performance at all? What if they served some other purpose entirely?" Frank's expression hardened. "Lady, I've been rebuilding these engines since before you were born. This isn't some computer simulation you can solve by changing a few variables. This is real mechanical work, and I'm telling you these modifications make no sense from any engineering perspective." The other mechanics murmured their agreement. One of them, a younger guy named Danny who couldn't have been much older than Cordelia, actually laughed out loud. "Come on, Frank, let the Boeing desk jockey play with the toys for a while. Maybe she can solve it with PowerPoint." The comment stung because it was exactly the kind of dismissive attitude Cordelia had faced throughout her career. In college, professors had suggested she might be happier in industrial design rather than aerospace engineering. At her first job, senior engineers had assigned her to documentation work while giving the interesting technical problems to her male colleagues. Even at Boeing, she'd had to fight for every significant project assignment, constantly proving that her gender didn't disqualify her from understanding complex mechanical systems. But this wasn't just about professional credibility. This was about her grandfather's legacy, about the family mystery that had shaped her entire career path without her fully realizing it. These men weren't just dismissing her engineering expertise. They were dismissing her connection to the pilot who died in this aircraft, the family history that had brought her 1,200 miles from home to volunteer her time and knowledge. Frank crossed his arms and delivered what he clearly thought was the final word on the subject. "Look, we've had specialists from the Smithsonian examine this engine. We've consulted with restoration experts from California to Florida. If they can't figure it out, what makes you think you can?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from the welding torches. 20 pairs of eyes watched Cordelia, waiting to see if she'd back down or dig in. In that moment, she had to choose between walking away to preserve her dignity or standing her ground against decades of combined experience that had already written her off as irrelevant. Cordelia looked Frank straight in the eye and said something that made the entire hangar go quiet. "Give me 2 hours alone with that engine. If I can't figure out what your grandfather's generation was trying to tell us, I'll buy the whole crew dinner and apologize for wasting your time." The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Frank studied her face, probably trying to figure out if she was bluffing or genuinely confident. Finally, he glanced around at the other mechanics, who were all watching this standoff like it was the most entertaining thing that had happened in months. 2 hours, Frank said slowly. "But you don't touch anything without permission. This engine is worth more than your car, and we're not about to let someone destroy a piece of history because they've got something to prove." "Fair enough," Cordelia replied. "I just need access to the engine, your wireless internet, and maybe some basic tools for non-invasive investigation." The mechanics scattered back to their various projects, but Cordelia could feel them watching her from the corners of their eyes. She just made the biggest professional gamble of her life, staking her reputation on a hunch she couldn't even fully articulate yet. If she failed, she'd be driving back to Seattle as just another corporate engineer who'd overestimated her abilities. She started by doing something the other experts apparently hadn't bothered with, taking photographs. Lots of them. She used her phone to capture every angle of the modifications, documenting the precise measurements and locations of each alteration. The work was methodical, almost obsessive, but that's how she'd always approached complex problems. Before you could solve anything, you had to truly understand what you were looking at. After 30 minutes of photography, she called me from the hangar floor. I was at work in my accounting office in Portland, but I could hear the excitement building in her voice as she described what she was seeing. "Maya, this is incredible," she said. "The modifications are mathematical. They follow a specific pattern based on fluid dynamics principles that weren't even theorized until the 1960s. Someone in 1944 understood airflow characteristics that wouldn't be formally documented for another 20 years. "So what does that mean?" I asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I have an idea forming. Let me do some research and call you back." She spent the next hour on her phone and laptop, pulling up original Boeing and Packard engineering specifications from the 1940s. She cross-referenced them with modern aerodynamic research, looking for connections between the engine modifications and advanced principles of internal flow management. The wireless signal in the hangar was terrible, so she had to walk outside every few minutes to load new web pages. But she kept at it with the same determination she'd shown as a kid rebuilding Dad's mower. The breakthrough came when she found a 1963 NASA technical paper about optimizing airflow in confined spaces. The mathematical relationships described in that paper matched the modification pattern in Grandpa's engine almost exactly. Someone in 1944 had been applying aerodynamic principles that wouldn't be officially recognized by the engineering community for another 2 decades. "That's impossible," she muttered to herself, but then she remembered something her thermodynamics professor had told her in college. "Just because we haven't discovered a principle yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Nature's laws don't wait for human understanding." With 40 minutes left on her self-imposed deadline, Cordelia made a decision that would have horrified the restoration team if they'd known about it. Instead of trying to disassemble the modifications like the previous experts had done, she decided to trace their purpose by following the airflow path through the engine using techniques she'd learned working on modern jet engines. She borrowed a fiber optic inspection camera from the restoration shop's equipment room, a tool typically used for examining internal engine damage without requiring complete disassembly. The device was about the size of a pencil with a tiny camera at the tip, designed to snake through tight spaces and transmit images back to a small monitor. As she threaded the camera through the modified passages, she started talking to herself the way she always did when working through complex problems. "Okay, so if the modifications aren't about performance, what are they about? What would someone in 1944 need to hide inside an engine that was important enough to risk destroying the power output?" The other mechanics had stopped pretending to work on their own projects. They were openly watching her now, probably wondering what this Boeing engineer thought she could accomplish with an inspection camera that months of traditional investigation had missed. Frank stood with his arms crossed, checking his watch every few minutes like he was already planning where the crew wanted to go for the dinner she was going to owe them. But Cordelia wasn't paying attention to their skepticism anymore. She was completely focused on the images coming back from inside the engine, following the path of the modifications deeper into the power plant's guts than anyone had thought to look before. The fiber optic camera revealed something that made Cordelia's breath catch in her throat. Deep inside the modified supercharger housing, hidden behind what looked like a solid metal wall, was a carefully machined cavity about the size of a soda can. The space had been sealed so precisely that it was completely invisible from any external examination, accessible only by following the exact path of the airflow modifications. "Frank, you need to see this," Cordelia called out, her voice tight with excitement. Frank walked over reluctantly, probably expecting to see another dead end that would prove his point about fancy equipment being useless for real mechanical work. But when he looked at the camera monitor, his expression changed completely. The image clearly showed a small cylindrical object wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth, still intact after 75 years of storage. "What in the hell is that?" Frank whispered. The other mechanics crowded around the monitor, their skepticism evaporating as they stared at the impossible discovery. Someone had created a secret compartment inside a World War II aircraft engine, using modifications that looked like mechanical sabotage to hide something they desperately needed to protect. Getting the object out required careful work with specialized tools. Frank supervised every step, his attitude toward Cordelia completely transformed now that she'd found something no one else had even suspected existed. It took another 30 minutes to extract the cylinder without damaging either the engine or the mysterious contents, but finally they had it sitting on the workbench under the harsh fluorescent lights. The metal container was about 6 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, made from what looked like aircraft-grade aluminum. Despite decades of storage, it showed no signs of corrosion or damage. The old cloth wrapping had protected it perfectly from moisture and temperature changes. Frank used a small screwdriver to carefully pry open one end of the cylinder, revealing contents that would rewrite everything our family thought we knew about Captain Thaddeus Hayes. Inside were several rolls of microfilm, each one smaller than a cigarette, along with a handwritten letter folded around them. The paper was yellowed with age but perfectly legible, written in the careful script that people learned in school during the 1920s and 1930s. At the top of the first page, in our grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "To my future family." Cordelia's hands shook as she unfolded the letter and began reading aloud. The hangar had gone completely silent, except for the distant hum of ventilation fans and the occasional sound of metal cooling in the desert heat. Every mechanic in the building had stopped working to listen to words written by a dead pilot more than 7 decades earlier. "If someone finds this, it means I didn't make it home from my last mission. The microfilm in this container shows German aircraft designs that are years ahead of anything our intelligence services know about. I've been photographing installations and documents during my training flights, using my cover as a pilot instructor to gather information that could change the course of this war." The letter went on to explain that our grandfather hadn't been flying routine training missions at all. He'd been working as an intelligence courier, using his access to airfields and his reputation as an exceptional pilot to photograph German research facilities and captured enemy aircraft. The military had given him modified flight plans that took him over sensitive areas, always maintaining his cover as a regular training pilot in case he was captured or killed. "The Germans are developing jet aircraft that could dominate our air forces within 2 years," the letter continued. "They have rocket technology that could reach American cities from European launch sites. Most terrifying of all, they're working on guidance systems that could make these weapons accurate enough to target specific military installations." Frank looked up from the letter with disbelief written across his face. "Your grandfather was a spy." But Cordelia kept reading, her voice growing stronger as the full scope of our grandfather's secret mission became clear. The modifications to his engine weren't random at all. They'd been designed specifically to create this hidden storage space, allowing him to transport classified photographs and documents without detection, even if his aircraft was captured intact. The final paragraph of the letter hit like a physical blow. "I know my aircraft has been compromised. Someone suspects what I'm really doing, and I don't think I'll survive my next flight. But this information is too important to die with me. If my family finds this someday, know that I chose to risk everything because freedom is worth fighting for. I hope my sacrifice helps build a world where my grandchildren can reach for the stars without fear. The letter was signed Captain Thaddeus Hayes, October 14, 1944, the day before his fatal crash. The room stayed silent for a long moment as the implications sank in. Our grandfather hadn't died in a training accident caused by mechanical failure. He'd been murdered by enemy agents who discovered his intelligence work. The routine training flight had been his final mission, and he'd known he probably wouldn't survive it. Frank looked at Cordelia with something approaching awe. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology, and your grandfather, he was a hero none of us knew about." The first call Cordelia made was to me, and I could barely understand her through the tears and excitement in her voice. "Maya, we found him. We found Grandpa's real story." She spent 20 minutes on the phone explaining everything, while Frank and the other mechanics carefully examined the microfilm using a magnifying glass and strong lighting. Even without proper development equipment, they could see enough detail to confirm that the images showed advanced aircraft designs, unlike anything the Allies had possessed in 1944. Within hours, the discovery had attracted attention from military historians, World War II researchers, and intelligence community veterans who specialized in declassified wartime operations. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the National Museum of World War II in New Orleans drove straight to Phoenix when she heard about the find. She brought proper microfilm viewing equipment and immediately began cataloging the photographs our grandfather had risked his life to preserve. The intelligence was extraordinary. The microfilm contained detailed images of German Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, V-2 rocket components, and most significantly, early designs for what would later become intercontinental ballistic missile guidance systems. Dr. Martinez confirmed that several of the technical innovations shown in the photographs hadn't been officially discovered by Allied intelligence until months after our grandfather's death. Captain Hayes was documenting technology that could have changed the entire trajectory of the war, Dr. Martinez explained to our family during a conference call 3 days later. These photographs show that German engineering was even more advanced than we realized. The intelligence community had no idea they were so close to developing precision-guided long-range weapons. The official recognition came 6 months later. The Department of Defense amended our grandfather's service record to reflect his intelligence work, reclassifying his death from training accident to killed in action while conducting classified operations. The ceremony at Randolph Field in Texas felt surreal, watching a military honor guard present our family with the Distinguished Flying Cross that should have been awarded 75 years earlier. But the personal impact went deeper than military honors. Cordelia finally understood why she'd always felt drawn to aerospace engineering, why she'd spent her childhood taking apart engines, why she'd chosen to build her career around the machines that had defined our grandfather's secret mission. The connection wasn't just coincidental. It was genetic destiny expressing itself across 3 generations. "I used to think I was just good with mechanical systems," Cordelia told me after the ceremony. "But now I realize I inherited more than just technical aptitude. I inherited his curiosity, his refusal to accept surface explanations, his need to look deeper when everyone else sees only the obvious." The restoration team's attitude toward her had changed completely. Frank Torino became one of her strongest supporters, often calling her for consultation on difficult mechanical mysteries. Pete Kowalski started telling people that the best engineers were the ones who combined book learning with intuitive understanding, using Cordelia as his primary example. Even Danny, the youngest mechanic who'd made jokes about PowerPoint presentations, apologized and asked if she'd recommend him for an aerospace engineering program. The broader lesson resonated far beyond our family. Cordelia's discovery became a powerful case study in challenging assumptions about people's capabilities. She'd succeeded where 40 years of traditional mechanical expertise had failed, not because she was smarter or more experienced, but because she approached the problem from a completely different perspective. Her background in modern aerodynamics allowed her to recognize patterns that vintage aircraft specialists had dismissed as meaningless. The commemorative Air Force invited Cordelia to become their lead consulting engineer for historical aircraft restoration. She now spends her vacation time traveling to museums and restoration shops across the country, helping solve mechanical mysteries that have stumped experts for decades. Every project teaches her something new about the ingenuity and courage of the pilots and engineers who came before her. Our grandfather's P-51 Mustang now flies in airshows throughout the Southwest, carrying a special placard that tells the story of Captain Thaddeus Hayes and his secret intelligence mission. Cordelia often attends these events, watching from the ground as the aircraft that nearly took his secrets to the grave performs aerobatic routines that would have amazed him. She keeps his final letter in a frame on her desk at Boeing, next to a photograph of him standing beside his aircraft. Every time she faces a difficult engineering challenge, every time someone suggests that a problem is too complex or that her approach is too unconventional, she reads those words about reaching for the stars and fighting for freedom. The mystery that had haunted our family for 3 generations taught us that the most important truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right combination of knowledge, persistence, and courage to reveal them. Our grandfather's legacy wasn't just about wartime heroism. It was about the power of looking deeper, questioning assumptions, and never accepting that something is impossible just because no one has figured it out yet. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from proving others wrong,